I am excited to talk to you all about the diplomacy collections here at Yale. I do think of them as a bit of a hidden gem, generating a lot of scholarly use, but not always at the forefront of people's minds when they think of the Beinecke. This is not a new collecting area for Yale Special Collections. It goes back really about a century, even longer if we take into account the various family papers that Yale Library had collected, which also documented a lot of diplomatic engagement in the country as well. So I'm just going to talk a little bit for a few minutes today about the history of the collection, and give you a little sense of what's there, show you a couple of examples from the collection. Then I do want to turn it over to Donald Lyman, who has graciously joined us today to talk about his papers, which I'm incredibly excited to add to this diplomatic collection as well, as you know, as we continue to add, as Michael said, for future scholarship and research. So to just start off, again, this is not a new collecting area necessarily for Yale. Really over the past century, Yale University librarians, curators, archivists have really built a deep collection centered on the US's engagement with the world and how that engagement really intersects with US politics, US identity, and other issues within the country. This collection first started at Sterling, and then it was centered for a long time at what was Manuscripts and Archives, and is now part of the Beinecke Library and Yale Special Collections. The diplomatic collections, diplomatic papers include personal papers, organizational records, photographs, ephemera, maps, books, and prints, really of lasting importance that showcase diverse perspectives about the US's role in the world. And within this collection, we can see the voices and lives of both well-known individuals that many of you are probably well aware of, have encountered in your history books and your history courses, but also they stand alongside people whose names are often absent from history books, really illustrating that this project of US diplomacy and US global engagement is not always a sort of like linear top-down enterprise, but one that's really forged through a diversity of opinions, ideologies, perspectives, and issues. So just a little bit about the collection itself. In 1923, following the participation by several members of the Yale faculty in the Paris peace conferences that yielded the Treaty of Versailles, Yale Library acquired the papers of Colonel Edward M. House. House, many of you are probably aware, was a top advisor to President Wilson, and led the U.S. negotiation, led the negotiation there at the peace conferences when Wilson would later arrive. The House acquisition yielded additional papers related to the First World War. Many of the faculty members who participated in what was known as the Inquiry, which was set up by President Wilson and House to begin doing essentially a set of ethnographic research about all the regions of the world in anticipation and in preparation for the Versailles Conference. Their papers came here as well. House had forged a close friendship with Charles Seymour, who was a history professor at Yale, one of the world's foremost experts at the time on the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and would later become president of Yale University. So Seymour's papers, Clive Day, Sidney Mezie's, the inquiry papers would all come to Yale in that interwar period. And it was also during that time where Yale began to embrace a post-war mission to train students specifically for service in both civic life and international affairs. By the early 1930s, the university established an institutional presence for world studies, and that led to the creation of the Institute for International Relations. People like Nicholas Speakman were involved in this institute. And eventually what happens is there's a mutually beneficial relationship between the library, academic departments, and foreign policy practitioners that emerge in that interwar period and into the post-Second World War period, where many of the Yale students who were trained for foreign service and international relations would go on to careers, but would also, when their career was nearing its end, would donate their papers back to Yale. So we would have, so what ultimately happens is there is a critical mass of diplomacy papers, individuals' papers at the library that allows scholars, researchers, faculties the ability to continue to train and teach new practitioners with those available archival resources. So over time, this collecting area did evolve to incorporate not only the papers of specific diplomats, ambassadors, and others, but as I mentioned, it came to include personal papers of elite, non-elite individuals, people who were writing on the topic of U.S. foreign policy, questions of U.S. interventionism, isolationism, restraint, exemplarism, and many of the debates really surrounding the United States' global mission, both in that interwar period and as the United States entered into the Cold War era. I'll just mention briefly here, the collection does include the papers of 5 former U.S. Secretaries of State, William Maxwell Evarts, Henry Louis Stimson, Dean Acheson, Henry Kissinger, and Cy Vance. But we also have papers of U.S. ambassadors who served in embassies and posts throughout the world. People like Chester Bowles, who was U.S. ambassador to India, William Bullitt, who served as both U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union in the 1930s and later U.S. ambassador to France. We also have included over the years papers of individuals who worked in intelligence services as well. And I like to think about this collection in terms of very broad terms. That really includes not just people who worked for foreign service, but also journalists, photographers, public intellectuals, and foreign policy dissenters who comment on the global role and responsibilities of the United States. All of these types of papers can be found in our collection of this individual. Like I said, many of these papers are individuals whose names you would not find in textbooks, but nonetheless had an impact or on the course and shape and understanding of U.S. global engagement. Just to give you a couple of examples, because it's always nice to just look at a couple of examples here. Let me see if I can share my screen. So I mentioned, no, this is not. I mentioned, let's see. There it is. I mentioned the House Diaries, for example. This is always a fun piece to share with students and scholars. This is actually from Edward House. Again, he was a top advisor to President Wilson, handling a lot of the foreign policy during the Wilson administration. This is he was a very thorough diarist, and those diaries we do have as part of the House papers here at Yale. This is from May 7th, 1915. Students of history may be very aware of that date, of what happened on May 7th, 1915. It was the day of the sinking of the Lusitania by the Germans. He happens to record in this diary that before that happens, that he meets with the British King, receiving house in the study on the floor of his second floor, overlooking the gardens, very cordial. And he said, and he asked, what is, suppose they should sink the Lusitania with American passengers aboard. I replied, as I had to Gray, the effect that it would have on our people. He does talk a few pages before in his diary about talking with the British foreign minister about this very potential problem if an ocean liner had been sunk with the Germans. So this is just some of the type of material that you can see in our papers, in the diplomacy papers. I'll give you another just very quick couple of other quick examples here in our another. No, this one. No. From the Chester Bowles papers, again, former governor of Connecticut, later U.S. ambassador to India, correspondence he has with President Johnson during the Vietnam War. This is early 1964, where he's giving basically some unvarnished advice to President Johnson about the Vietnam War, and even takes it upon himself to write a speech for Johnson that was never delivered, as far as I know, but on draft proposed speech for President Johnson on relations of American populist New Deal tradition to overseas development, sort of framing the Vietnam War in that way. So, again, just a couple of these are just a couple of examples of some of the things you would find in our diplomacy papers. And I like to say that, sometimes the significance of this really is that, while, our friends in the, at the National Archives and other government agencies are working to collect the official record of U.S. foreign relations, it's often these personal papers that, give us a sense of the behind the scenes decision making. They reveal the complicated nature of foreign policy making, motivations behind it, and consequences. Sometimes you get into these collections, they can offer a very good counter narrative to the official record. They can showcase where dissent emerges. You get into deep dives of these papers, they can reveal personal disagreement, unvarnished advice, moments when counsel may have been held back, and really adding to the diverse record and the chorus about the sources and narrative about the direction and composition of U.S. foreign policy. And they can also provide insights into the various intellectual currents and questions that really were proving formative in individuals as they worked in foreign service. So, collecting this, keeping this collection, building this collection, I always sort of think of it as serving as an important reminder that U.S. foreign policy making is really entrusted to our fellow citizens who work for the Foreign Service to carry out that policy on behalf of the nation. So it is an active collecting area, as I mentioned, and I do want to turn this over to Donald Lyman. As I mentioned, his diaries from his time in Mexico, in the Foreign Service serving in Mexico in the 1980s, were recently added to our diplomacy collection. They're a very welcome addition. As we were chatting just before the event, there's always a bit of a lag in scholarship on foreign policy because government records do take time to get released, to get vetted through official government channels, through the State Department, through their Office of Historians. So oftentimes we rely on papers, diaries, letters, correspondence, the personal papers of individuals like Mr. Lyman. So Don, I'll just turn it over to you. If you'd like to talk about your papers, I can pull up your some of your slides if you like as well. But I want to also thank you again for joining us today.
Great, thank you, Josh. Thanks, Michael. And Josh, thanks for helping me through the process of getting my diary into your collection. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll discuss why I kept a diary from 1982 to 1984 when I was a diplomat in Mexico, what my diary tells us about that period, which was a turning point in U.S.-Mexican relations, and I'll explain why we should care today about something that happened 40 years ago. I show this initial slide just to show you some of the players, and you see Ambassador John Gavin who was ambassador to Mexico from 1981 to 1986. You see President Lopez Portillo of Mexico, who was president from 76 to 82, riding with President Reagan. You see President Miguel de la Madrid, who was president from 1982 to 1988. And then there's a picture of Woodrow Wilson and a picture of Mexico and its borders in 1821. And I just include Wilson and the borders because the first year at least that I was in Mexico, and even after, I didn't go to any meeting with a Mexican official where they didn't either mention Wilson and ask if I knew what he'd done in Mexico, intervening there a couple of times, or what happened on the border after the Mexican War and after Texas got its independence. So I had a good answer on Wilson. I'd written my dissertation on Wilson. So after a while, people started to bring that up. But I wanted to show that at the start because trying to change US-Mexican relations and put those relations on a better footing, which was what the Reagan administration tried to do, one of the biggest obstacles was the past. And the Mexicans were bound by their past, not only in their own minds, their own limits of what was possible, but also what was politically viable in Mexico. There was always a certain sense that they had to co-opt the Mexican left and protect themselves from criticism. So today I'll discuss why I kept the diary, what my diary tells us about that period, which was a turning point, and as I said, why should we care? I had studied diplomatic history and always thought diaries were the most useful source for research. Cables and memos are often contradictory. Sometimes someone at state or another agency will draft a cable on Monday and send it, and on Wednesday, someone else will send a cable that contradicts it. So it's sometimes very hard to go back through the cable traffic and figure out what people were really trying to say, or whether the cables even indicated policy or not. And sometimes when embassies received a cable, they would ignore it or modify the instructions. Maybe in a perfect world that shouldn't happen, but in the real world it does, especially with strong ambassadors. Oral histories and memoirs can be useful, but they depend heavily on memory and on how recently they're done after the events. And oral histories depend a lot on who's asking the questions and how skillful they are. Phone calls and transcripts can be great, but often people speak elliptically on the phone, knowing they're being recorded. And letters can be great. Do people still write letters? Now I'm not so sure, but back in the time of Wilson, or even when Gavin was in Mexico, people wrote letters, and often those letters had a lot of information that are useful to historians. Some background on that period and on my decision to write the diary. In March 1981, President Reagan named John Gavin as ambassador to Mexico as a political appointee, and in June he went to Mexico. I went to Mexico in August 1981 as Ambassador Gavin's special assistant, and later I was acting deputy chief of mission for almost a year. At first, I managed the ambassador's calendar, his paper flow, his information flow, and over time I got more involved in economic and trade issues. The ambassador had another special assistant who worked on law enforcement and border issues. Gavin was well qualified. He and President Reagan were both actors. They'd been president of the Screen Actors Guild. He was a skilled negotiator from being an actor and also being president of the union. His mother was from Sonora. He was bilingual in Spanish. He graduated with honors in Latin American studies from Stanford, and he was well connected in Mexico. One senior Foreign Service officer even commented at the time that Gavin was better connected when he went to Mexico than most ambassadors are when they leave. He knew people in politics, economics, in the cultural scene there. Carlos Fuentes was a distant cousin. He was well connected in intellectual circles. Gavin was close to Reagan. They weren't close friends, but they knew each other well. They shared similar views of Mexico. And Reagan made it clear from the first that Gavin was his point man for US-Mexican relations. But despite all that, the appointment was initially criticized in both countries, in the press, government statements to the press in Mexico, gossip in the State Department that was kind of vicious at first. But Gavin's initial meetings in Washington went very well, and the senior diplomats on the Mexican desk put word out in the department that he was a serious person, well qualified, and knew a lot about Mexico. So the gossip kind of died down. At that point, US-Mexican relations were at a low point. At the start of the Carter administration, and Carter and Lopez Portillo began pretty much at the same time. And both of them wanted to improve US-Mexican relations. But by the time Carter left office, he and Lopez Portillo hated each other, and that dislike had kind of pervaded US-Mexican relations, and there hadn't been much real progress on most issues. I had made sporadic efforts at a diary when I first got to Mexico, but by mid-1982, I was really sure that Ambassador Gavin and President Reagan were really trying to change US-Mexican relations for the better. And at the same time, Mexico's financial crisis was deepening, worse than any it had faced before. So from then on, I kept the diary fairly faithfully. It's a diplomatic diary. It's not, my life in Mexico. And the aim was to create a source for historians. Gavin and I talked about writing a book together, but that never happened. But I donated the diary hoping that someone would use it when they try and write the history of that period that I never wrote. I think the main value of the diary to researchers is to show that the Reagan administration and Gavin specifically were skilled and mostly successful in their efforts to change our relationship with our neighboring country. And that desire for change was driven, their desire for change was driven not only by the political and economic risks in Mexico, but the potential in the relationship. They believed a stable, successful Mexico was crucial to the US. They wanted to grow trade, investment, and tourism and cultural ties. And of course, they thought more access to Mexican oil would be good for the US. And this is, I think, something that's really important to think about today. They saw the active border as mostly positive, a safety valve for Mexico, a great route for trade. And they knew that there were many actual and potential problems on the border, but they saw the border more as an opportunity than a threat. Mexico was not part of the domino theory of a growing communist threat that guided Reagan administration policy towards Central America and the Caribbean. The PRI had been the one party governing Mexico since the 1920s, and they kept very tight control on the domestic left in Mexico through co-optation and coercion when necessary. And the Soviets and Cubans operated in Mexico in what they were doing towards the US and other countries, but they didn't interfere in Mexican politics, which was part of the rule for letting them operate their operations directed elsewhere. The Mexicans talked a lot about Cuba and being non-aligned and support for revolutionary governments, but they also shared intelligence with the US government about what the Cubans and Soviets were doing in Mexico, and they were very anxious to make sure that nothing was happening that was outside the kind of rules that they'd set. So there wasn't much fear in the US government that Mexico would be a domino towards communism unless Mexico fell into total chaos, which was something the US hoped to prevent. Gavin and Reagan were sensitive to Mexico's historical memory of US interventions and Mexico's public policy of support for revolutionary regimes, but they wanted to avoid Mexico kind of throwing it in the face of the US. Like in 1981, a bunch of American diplomats came, and their purpose was early 1981, before Gavin was there, to warn Mexico about Cuban interference in Central America. And that got in the press. And about a week later, Lopez Portillo gave a big speech where he said that Cuba was the best loved country in the world for Mexico. And that was kind of a slap in the face to the US. And that kind of thing had been happening pretty often for years. But the message really from the Reagan administration was, okay, we know how you feel, we know what you have to do, but kind of do as little as possible and don't talk to us about something and then a week later give an abrazo to Fidel that's going to kind of make us look bad. Not being bound by the past was a lot harder with Lopez Portillo than with De La Madrid, who was less volatile, had a better team with a few exceptions, and was much more committed to the future, not just to looking back. The skill and success that Gavin and the Reagan administration showed was really counter to the prevailing view at the time and a lot that's been written since. So how did they go about changing US-Mexican relations? A lot of it was blunt talk and private, and I emphasize the private, by Reagan and senior Reagan administration officials, and especially by Ambassador Gavin. The Reagan administration was very creative and persistent in a massive financial assistance package to Mexico during the 1982 financial crisis there. And that package almost failed twice when Mexican officials below Lopez Portillo invoked the past against US pressure to sign the agreement. And it was really a very close thing that took hundreds of phone calls to really make sure that it happened. And I think a lot of the historical accounts miss just how hard it was. The Reagan administration took very subtle steps on trade and energy that really advanced the relationship. And on Central America, which has often been, relations about Central America have often been mischaracterized, Gavin resisted a few officials in Washington who wanted to make Central America the key issue in US-Mexican relations. And the US did want to change Mexican views of the Nicaraguan and Cuban role there. And over time, they had a little bit of success. The heavy Mexican assistance to Nicaragua under Lopez Portillo declined under De La Madrid, and Mexican public statements moderated a little. But I wouldn't call that really a success area of changing Mexican policy or actions, but more a success area in not letting it poison or change or shape the entire relationship between the countries. The diary mentions some attempts to come to grips with corruption and drug trafficking in Mexico. Gavin warned the Mexicans often that if they let the narcotics, the cartels developing at that time control the drug trade unimpeded, they'd eventually come to really be above the law, and it would really rot out Mexican society. That didn't really change anything, and no one's had much success since getting changes in those areas, corruption and drug trafficking. I think my diary helps to understand Gavin's efforts to change how the embassy functioned, and he had his own ideas about how he should function. It was a huge embassy, over 1,000 people, half were Mexican employees. There were more than 15 agencies, 10 or so consulates. There was even a section of the embassy, an office established and funded by the US Congress to water the graves of US soldiers who'd been killed in the Mexican War and buried in Mexico City 140 years before. The state sections of the embassy reported mainly through the deputy chief of mission, but many of the other agencies technically reported to the ambassador, which was kind of a clumsy schedule. There were many visits by congressmen, executive branch officials, corporate executives, professors, press, visitors from the US and other countries. The embassy was kept busy with hundreds of thousands of US residents in Mexico and even more US tourists, even then, before Cancun really developed. Gavin's idea of his role was different from a lot of ambassadors, even political ambassadors. He saw himself as getting direction from the president, and that was in fact true. He worked with cabinet secretaries who in most cases understood his mandate from President Reagan. He knew many of the important players, some from growing up in California, from Stanford, some from California Republican politics, some from just social contacts, and he made his own ties with the people he didn't know in Washington. He did a lot of important work in Washington himself and wasn't that dependent on the Mexican desk at state. He was very determined to use his power as ambassador carefully. When he first came to Mexico, the deputy chief of mission at the time, every time he got a request from the State Department to send a message to the Mexican government, he asked Gavin to do it. And Gavin only wanted to go there with the most important messages. So the embassy team learned that over time. He was much more active than his predecessors in supporting US business in Mexico. And he tried hard to make the embassy more secure and healthy in a very heavily polluted city. He tried hard to get better economic and political reporting, mostly at the behest of the State Department. The first few years, the best reporting was done by a summer intern in the embassy, which gives you an idea of how bad the situation was from the regular economic and political officers there. But that got a lot better over time as Gavin brought in new people with a lot higher skill levels. When I became acting DCM, I worked with the ambassador to set weekly goals for the section chiefs and then work with them on trying to achieve those goals. And we put the stronger section chiefs in charge of some of the weaker ones, which was fairly controversial at the time, but I think worked reasonably well. I left in mid-1984, and a lot of things happened after I left. The Mexican earthquake and its aftermath, the torture and murder of DEA agent Camarena, a lot of controversy over the ambassador's contacts with the Mexican opposition. But I think by 1984, things were on a better track and US-Mexican relations were in a much more positive state that really lasted for decades. So why should we care today about that period 40 years ago? Mexico is more crucial today than ever before. It's our number one trading partner, close to $1 trillion in bilateral trade, over 200 billion in direct US investment, 40 million US visitors each year, and over 1 million Americans live in Mexico, at least 1.2 million. The border is still a huge opportunity and a huge challenge, not only trade, but smuggling of people and drugs from Mexico, arms from the US smuggled into Mexico, water availability issues, environmental challenges, health challenges. The relationship's still difficult and potentially volatile. As even events in the last few weeks have shown us, memories of the past are still strong in Mexico, and they're very sensitive to appearances of being directed or managed from the US. But how change was achieved then through private pressure combined with public health and cooperation, not through leaks or public blasts at the Mexican government, was how things were improved and changed. And I think the challenges of managing a large embassy and being effective as a political appointee are really the same then as they are now. And a lot of what Gavin did and what he accomplished, I think, holds some useful lessons for other political appointees and even career ambassadors. So I hope historians will use my diary and other sources to write the story of that period. Thank you very much.